The sun was still hanging low in the sky when Colonel James Carter steered his black Ford Edge into the dusty lot of a small gas station off Route 29, just outside of Culpeper County, Virginia. It had been a long, high-stakes debrief at a classified military facility near Washington, D.C., and Carter was ready for some brief respite. His uniform was crisp, his boots polished to a mirror shine, and his nameplate gleamed on his chest. He looked tired but not defeated. This was the kind of exhaustion that comes from shouldering more responsibility than most people would ever understand. Carter shut the engine off and stepped out of the car, stretching his back as he took a deep breath of the humid air. The familiar sense of gasoline and old rubber filled the air. And for a moment, he was reminded of the long days spent traveling the country, often in places like this, small, unassuming, tucked away from the noise of the world. His phone buzzed in the center console, a text from his aide blinking across the screen. He glanced at it but decided to ignore it for now. First coffee, then he'd get back on the road. Inside the gas station, the place was nearly empty, save for a teenage clerk behind the counter, wearing a hoodie with the logo of a sporting goods store. In the corner, a man scratched off lottery tickets, his eyes darting between the cards in his phone. The place had that quiet, empty feel of a forgotten corner of the world, where time seemed to move slower. Carter grabbed a bottle of water and a protein bar, then walked up to the counter. The clerk didn't say anything at first, just stared at him, his gaze moving from the patches on Carter's arm to his face, and then down to the nameplate on his uniform. "You in the military or something?" the clerk asked slowly, eyes narrowing slightly. "I am," Carter replied plainly, placing his items on the counter. The clerk hesitated for a moment, then rung up his purchase. Carter paid in cash and offered a polite thank you. As he turned to leave, he felt the shift in the air. It was subtle but palpable, like something was off. A quiet tension settled in the space around him. It didn't need words to make its presence known. Outside, Carter stood near his car, dialing his driver to give him an update. The man was supposed to meet him further down the road, and Carter wanted to make sure everything was in order. He spoke softly but clearly, still in full view of the storefront windows. As he glanced down at his watch, he caught movement in the corner of his eye. Two sheriff's cruisers pulling in fast. One slid in behind his SUV, the other parked near the pumps. Doors slammed open, boots hitting pavement. For a split second, Carter wondered if there had been a robbery nearby. But the way they looked at him, hands already near their holsters, jaws clenched, told him otherwise. The first officer, a tall man with thinning blonde hair and mirrored sunglasses, stepped forward. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to put that phone down and keep your hands where I can see them." Carter blinked, momentarily thrown off guard, then said calmly, "I'm Colonel James Carter. I just came from—" "I said hands where I can see them now," the officer interrupted. The second officer, stockier and shorter, circled behind Carter, too close for comfort. Carter slowly placed his phone on the hood of his vehicle and kept his hands visible. "I'd like to know what this is about," he said, still measured. "We got a call about someone matching your description, acting suspicious, military gear, loitering, aggressive attitude," the first officer said, his voice flat. Carter looked from one officer to the other, stunned. "I've been here 6 minutes," he said, disbelief creeping into his voice. "I bought a snack, made a call, and stood by my car." He held out his identification. "You have any ID on you?" The second officer, already reaching for his cuffs, didn't acknowledge Carter's words. "Yes, you can check," Carter said, his voice even. But before he could finish, the officer grabbed his left wrist, yanking him toward the cruiser. "Sir, I'm a commissioned officer in the United States Army," Carter said, voice steady but rising with the underlying tension. "You're making a mistake. You're not above the law because you play dress-up," the first officer spat. That's when Carter realized this wasn't about a suspicious call. This was about control. The officer twisted his arms behind his back, slapping the cuffs on tighter than necessary. Carter's body tensed, but he didn't resist. No sudden moves, no raised voice. Just breathe. The parking lot had grown quieter. The man with the lottery tickets had moved to the window, watching. A woman filling up her gas tank had stopped mid-fill, phone in hand. The whole scene was turning still. The officers didn't seem to care. His rank meant nothing. His poise meant nothing. His uniform meant nothing. They saw a threat where there was none. But that wasn't the end of it, because James Carter wasn't just anyone. He had connections. He had a line to people who didn't wait for permission to act. Handcuffed in broad daylight, in full uniform, Colonel James Carter, a man who had commanded troops, negotiated with foreign officials, and briefed the highest-ranking government leaders, was now standing between two local deputies like a common suspect. No reading of rights, no explanation beyond the word suspicious. The air outside was thick with tension, the heat of the day pressing down on the small parking lot as Carter stood between the two officers, his hands cuffed behind his back. The second officer, a stocky man with a red face, pulled at Carter's elbow, trying to guide him toward the cruiser. Carter didn't resist. He remained still, eyes locked ahead, keeping his expression impassive. But inside, his mind was racing. This was wrong, so wrong. He'd been a decorated officer for over 2 decades, and in all that time, never had he been treated like this. He could feel the eyes of onlookers boring into him, some with pity, others with confusion, but none with the courage to speak up. He had lived through worse. He had faced down threats in far more dangerous places, but nothing had ever felt quite like this. "Where's your ID now?" the first officer barked, stepping closer, trying to assert dominance in a situation he clearly didn't understand. The tone was thick with disdain, like Carter was some sort of criminal, rather than the man who had served his country with distinction. Carter didn't flinch. His posture remained straight, shoulders squared, though he could feel the pressure of the cuffs digging into his wrists. "It's in my bag," he said calmly, his voice steady. "In the side pocket. You'll find it there." The second officer, still glaring, reached into the bag without consent, yanking it out like it was a piece of contraband. Carter felt the familiar knot in his stomach tighten. The officer pulled out a leather case, opened it, and the confusion started to creep into his face as he saw the federal clearance within. "Colonel, no, Brigadier General Carter," he muttered, sounding unsure now, the weight of Carter's identification clearly catching him off guard. You're really..." The first officer's sharp intake of breath interrupted him. "Doesn't change what the clerk said," he grumbled. "He said she was acting suspicious." Carter's mind flashed for a moment to the clerk inside, the young man who had looked at him with an uncomfortable expression when he entered. The suspicion wasn't about anything Carter had done, but about the fact that a black man in military gear was standing in front of them. The weight of this realization was hard to ignore. It wasn't just the call that had prompted this. This was about how they perceived him, the assumptions they made the moment they saw his skin and uniform. The first officer pulled out his radio, muttering something unintelligible into the device. The second officer, still flustered, glanced around at the growing crowd of onlookers. More people had gathered now, perhaps 5 or 6. Some were watching in silence, others still recording the incident with their phones. Carter could feel the weight of their gazes on him, and though he knew they were witnessing an injustice, he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of frustration. "Get back to what you're doing," the first officer barked at one of the teenagers recording the scene, his voice growing more defensive as the pressure built. "This ain't none of your business." The teenager didn't budge. He held his phone steady, the red light of recording flashing as if it had become a weapon in its own right. Carter closed his eyes for a moment, forcing himself to stay calm. The urge to speak up was overwhelming, but in this moment, silence was his shield. If he fought back, if he raised his voice, it would only escalate. He had to play it smart. His military training kicked in. Remain calm, assess the situation, wait for the right moment. He wasn't going to make a mistake. "Let me speak to my Pentagon liaison," he said, his voice unwavering despite the pressure of the moment. His eyes flicked from the first officer to the second, measuring them both. The second officer laughed, a sharp, mocking sound. "You're what?" he sneered. "You're Pentagon liaison? You think anyone's gonna believe you're some big shot standing here in cuffs?" Carter didn't respond to the mockery. He knew this was the moment where things could go either way. He could let it slide or he could push further, but pushing too hard might make things worse. "I think you should check the badge number on my ID," Carter said, voice quiet but firm. "And I think you should make that call before this becomes bigger than you can handle." The shorter officer's face twisted into something between confusion and annoyance. "Is that a threat?" he snapped, stepping closer, his body language aggressive. "It's a suggestion," Carter replied calmly, standing tall and unflinching. He could see the crack in the officer's resolve now, the brief flicker of doubt in his eyes. Silence stretched between them like a rope pulled taut. Behind the quiet hum of the gas pumps, the shuffle of people, too scared or too stunned to speak, was the only sound. The phones stayed up, their red recorders blinking. The officer holding Carter's bag finally opened it again and pulled out the military ID, still clearly marked with the federal insignia. "Colonel, no, Brigadier General Carter," the officer repeated, this time confusion creeping more fully into his voice. His fingers trembled as he looked from the ID to Carter, then back again. The taller officer, still trying to save face, muttered under his breath, but Carter caught it. "Doesn't change what the clerk said." The second officer, still holding the ID, looked back at Carter, his face now a mixture of frustration and uncertainty. They had no idea what to do. Their certainty had begun to crumble, but their egos were too strong to admit they had made a mistake. "Make the call," Carter said again, his patience starting to wear thin. "Before this gets out of hand." The seconds ticked by slowly, stretching out like hours. Carter could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. The officers hesitated, their eyes flicking between each other, their silence betraying their growing doubt. The bystanders were still watching, their phones recording the entire scene, and Carter knew that the moment was crucial. One wrong move, one raised voice, and this could spiral out of control. But he wouldn't give them that satisfaction. He wouldn't let them have the satisfaction of forcing him to break his composure. He stood there cuffed, in full military uniform, trying to stay calm in the face of the absurdity of it all. A general, someone who had led soldiers, negotiated with foreign powers, and briefed high-ranking officials, was being treated like a common criminal in broad daylight. No explanation, no reading of rights, just suspicion. "Make the call," Carter repeated, his voice firm but measured. The second officer was still holding the bag, his grip tightening around it like he was trying to find some excuse, some way to explain this away. His fingers trembled slightly as he glanced over the ID once more, but the shock hadn't fully worn off. It was as if he couldn't believe it, couldn't believe that someone like Carter, in that uniform, was standing there in cuffs, demanding to be treated like the officer he was. The first officer muttered something under his breath, but Carter could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. "You really think anyone's going to believe you're some big shot?" Carter didn't respond. He didn't need to. The doubt was in the air now. They both knew the truth. They just didn't want to admit it. But the longer they delayed, the more their mistake became apparent. "Call them," Carter said again, his tone growing a bit sharper, though he kept his calm. "Do it now." One of the onlookers, a young woman filling up her gas tank, spoke up, her voice quiet but firm. "You guys are really going to arrest a general over this?" she asked, her eyes wide with disbelief. The first officer glanced at her, clearly annoyed, but there was something in her voice that made him hesitate. He scowled and muttered, "Get back to what you're doing, ma'am. It's none of your business." But the woman didn't budge. She stood her ground, her phone still pointed in their direction. It was one more crack in the officer's facade, and Carter could see it, how the pressure was starting to weigh on them. They were unraveling. The second officer, still holding the ID, looked at the taller officer. "I don't know what to do with this. It says here, he's a general, but..." He stopped mid-sentence, his face flushed with embarrassment. The taller officer's jaw clenched, but instead of continuing the confrontation, he pulled out his radio again. This time, he wasn't as confident. He muttered something into the mic, his voice low and shaky, but the words were enough to trigger a change in the air around them. The tension, which had been mounting since the moment Carter had been stopped, shifted. Something was happening. Something was changing. Carter stood motionless, his heart steady, but his mind sharp. He'd been in more dangerous situations than this, more perilous predicaments, but nothing had ever felt quite like this. The humiliation, the unfairness. It wasn't just about him, it was about every black man, every person of color who had been treated this way, questioned because of assumptions. And now in this small rural gas station, he was the embodiment of that struggle. Lieutenant Colonel Garrett Brigham, the first officer's voice crackled through the radio, his voice wavering just slightly. Carter's eyes narrowed as he heard the name. Brigham, a familiar name, someone he could trust. Seconds passed, agonizingly slow, but soon a crisp voice came through the speaker. "Colonel Carter, this is Lieutenant Colonel Brigham," the voice on the other end said. "Are you safe to speak?" Carter exhaled slowly, but there was no sign of relief on his face. Not yet. He kept his tone even. "No, I've been detained unlawfully. Rural Virginia County Unit. Immediate assistance required." The officers froze at the sound of Brigham's voice, their gazes flicking between Carter and the phone he held. The second officer, still confused, looked around at the growing crowd. He shifted uncomfortably on his feet, clearly out of his depth. "Understood, General." Brigham's voice came back through the speaker. "Stay in place. Response team inbound." The line went dead and Carter's wrist still throbbed from the tightness of the cuffs, but he didn't flinch. He didn't smile. He simply waited. He had made the call. He had invoked the chain of command. And now they would see what happened when someone who wasn't supposed to be treated this way demanded the respect he had earned. The officer stood there blinking at Carter, stunned into silence for the first time since the altercation began. The first officer swallowed, his jaw tightening in frustration. "What did you just do?" he asked, his voice a whisper. "I did what you refused to do," Carter replied, his tone calm but sharp. "I called someone who actually knows who I am." Behind him, the gas station hum was the only sound now, the pumps quietly ticking away, the air hanging heavy. The officers stood motionless, unsure of what to do next. They had no backup, no explanation for their actions, and nothing left to cling to but their bruised egos. "Now," Carter said, his voice cool as he looked each officer in the eye. "You're going to fix this." The minutes seemed to stretch on forever as the officers stood in silence, unsure of what to do next. Carter remained still, his back straight, eyes locked ahead. He knew the wheels of bureaucracy were already turning, slowly but surely, and soon the situation would begin to unravel for the two deputies who had made the costly mistake of detaining him. The first officer finally moved, but it wasn't to release the cuffs. Instead, he reached for his radio again, but his movements were slow, hesitant. His jaw clenched as he muttered something into the device, his eyes flicking toward the growing crowd of onlookers who had gathered around the scene. People were still filming, some whispering to each other, others standing in stunned silence. The presence of so many witnesses only added to the officers' discomfort. They could feel the weight of the world on their shoulders, the certainty that they were on the verge of making an even bigger mistake. Carter didn't flinch. His posture remained firm, but inside his heart was a whirlwind of thoughts. He knew what was coming. He had been in this position before, though never quite like this. Never as a black man in a uniform, caught between a sense of duty and a racial system that often saw him as less than. But now with Brigham's confirmation, the situation was out of their hands. It was no longer just about their incompetence. It was about accountability. Seconds later, the sound of a vehicle engine reached Carter's ears, followed by the screech of tires on the asphalt. He knew the moment the vehicle pulled in that it wasn't just any backup. This was someone high up, someone with the authority to end this debacle. A black Escalade rolled to a stop in front of the gas station. Carter could see the tinted windows, the sleek, unmistakable silhouette of authority inside. The door opened and a man stepped out, his coat unbuttoned, his military ID already clipped to his belt. It was Lieutenant Colonel Garrett Brigham. Brigham's expression was one of purpose, his steps quick but measured as he approached. The officers stiffened when they saw him, recognizing the man as someone who could not only end the situation, but bring down the full weight of the military's justice if necessary. "Colonel Carter," Brigham called, his voice carrying over the sound of the surrounding tension. "You all right?" Carter's gaze didn't waver. He gave a small, measured nod, but his tone was sharp as he replied, "I'm fine to wait. I want to hear what happens next, right here." Brigham turned his attention to the officers, his eyes hardening. The officers tried to salvage some control over the situation, but they could feel the grip of their failure tightening around them. "I need the cuffs off her now," Brigham said, his voice low but carrying an edge that made it clear he wasn't asking. "Now!" The taller officer, still trying to salvage some semblance of authority, hesitated. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. There was nothing he could say. He had already made his mistake. His hands trembled as he moved toward Carter, fumbling for the key to unlock the cuffs. "I said now," Brigham repeated, his tone growing sharper. The officer finally relented, stepping behind Carter to release the cuffs. The steel snapped open, and Carter's hands were freed. The tension in the air eased slightly, but it didn't go away. The officers, though relieved that their boss had arrived, were still reeling from the reality of what had just transpired. Carter stretched his arms, rubbing his wrist where the cuffs had dug in, but he didn't move to comfort himself further. He knew the job wasn't done. There was still work to be done here, and he wasn't leaving until the consequences were clear. The first officer, looking for some way to regain control of the situation, finally spoke up. "Do you have any ID?" he asked, his voice attempting to sound authoritative but failing. Brigham turned to the officer slowly, his eyes cold. "You think the Pentagon sends someone without ID?" he asked, the disbelief in his voice dripping with contempt. Without waiting for a response, Brigham reached into his jacket and pulled out a sleek leather case. He handed it over to the officer, who hesitated before taking it, his hands trembling as he flipped open the case. Inside was a federal clearance badge, high level, unquestionable. It was the kind of ID that didn't need an explanation. The officer's face went pale as he read the credentials. "I need all body cam footage preserved," Brigham added, his voice low but stern. "And I suggest you don't tamper with it." The shorter officer, who had been visibly shaken throughout the entire ordeal, stood frozen, his face flushed red. The weight of what he had done was starting to hit him. He glanced over at his partner, seeking guidance, but all he got was the taller officer's hesitant look. Both officers were now caught in the net they had made for themselves. The tension in the air was palpable as Brigham continued. "You gentlemen might want to talk to your superiors," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument, "because this is already above your pay grade." The two officers exchanged a glance, but neither of them moved. There was nothing they could say. They had made their decision, and now they would have to live with the consequences. The silence that followed was thick, but it was broken by the sound of another vehicle pulling up. This time, it wasn't an Escalade. It was a silver Ford F-150, unmarked, but unmistakable. Another group of people stepped out. They were dressed in black suits, clearly high-ranking government officials, and their arrival only confirmed what Carter had known all along. The fallout from this incident was only beginning. Minutes later, the parking lot felt different, not quieter, but tighter, like everyone was holding their breath. The officers, now relieved from their duties, stood awkwardly at the edge of the scene, their shoulders slumped with the weight of their mistake. The agents in black suits had already dispersed, moving with precision, clearly on their way to clean up the mess that had been made. Carter remained still, his posture unchanged, though inside a quiet storm brewed. He had known this moment would come. He had known the consequences would be swift, and they would be just. "Do you have someone coming here?" the shorter officer asked hesitantly, his voice losing the edge it once had. His hands were no longer clenched in anger, but open in resignation. Carter nodded once, his gaze sharp. "Yes, they won't be asking for introductions." The officers glanced at each other, unsure whether Carter was bluffing, but they knew better than to challenge him now. His confidence had shattered the illusion they had built around themselves. They were unraveling right in front of him. From the corner of the parking lot, a woman, one of the bystanders, spoke up. "She's a general," she said, her voice clear, though it wasn't loud. "Why don't you just check?" Another bystander, a teenager who had been recording the incident, nodded in agreement. "Yeah, it says general right there on the ID. You cuffed a damn general." The officers said nothing. There was nothing more to say. Minutes later, the black SUVs arrived, 3 in total, pulling into the lot with military precision. The doors opened in sequence, and men and women in suits stepped out. They moved like chess pieces on a board, slipping into position as if rehearsed. The crowd watched in hushed silence. Carter's eyes scanned the scene, but his face remained unreadable. He had been in situations like this before, but never like this. Never so exposed, never so vulnerable. Yet somehow he felt a quiet sense of pride. One of the agents approached Brigham, speaking to him in low tones. Brigham nodded, then turned to Carter. "Ma'am, we'll have you debriefed off-site. You can ride with me." Carter paused. His eyes swept over the crowd. People still standing, still watching. He knew that what had happened in that parking lot wasn't just about him. It was about the message it sent. About the moment where everything had come to a head, and he wasn't going to let it slip by quietly. "No," Carter said, his voice carrying across the lot. "I'll wait right here. I want to hear what happens next." For the first time, the crowd seemed to react. People started shifting, a collective murmur rising through the air. The officers, stiff with discomfort, still hadn't moved. Carter wasn't going anywhere, not until the reality of what had just happened was fully realized. A few moments passed, and then another agent, this one with a badge from the Office of Military Legal Affairs, approached the officers. "Which one of you initiated the stop?" she asked, her tone sharp enough to cut steel. The two officers hesitated, exchanging glances. Finally, the shorter one spoke up, his voice strained. "We got a call from inside. Said someone in military gear was acting suspicious." The woman's gaze flicked to the clerk behind the counter, who immediately tried to shrink back into the shadows. The agent stepped toward him, her voice low but firm. "You made the call?" The clerk, nervous and sweating, nodded. I just thought she looked intimidating," he stammered. "I didn't mean anything by it." Carter's jaw clenched, but he didn't speak. The words of the clerk, the reasons for the call, it was all so clear. It wasn't about his actions, it was about his appearance, the way he was perceived before he even opened his mouth. As the legal team took over, handling the paperwork and the investigation, Carter remained in place. The scene had calmed, but the damage had already been done. He could feel it, everything shifting around him. This wasn't just a mistake that would go away. This was a turning point. A reporter from a local outlet approached him, mic in hand. "General Carter, can you comment on what happened here today?" he asked. Carter's eyes moved to the camera, then back to the reporter. "I don't want anyone fired to make a headline," he said, his voice steady. "I want the truth documented. I want procedures corrected. And I want those two officers to never hold a badge again." His words echoed through the lot, and for a moment, everything stood still. Then slowly, the crowd began to disperse. The officers were escorted away. The clerk disappeared behind the counter, his head down. In the following days, the story would break nationwide. Media outlets would replay the footage of Carter in cuffs, his calm composure in the face of injustice, and the outrage that followed. Letters poured in, from other service members, from veterans, from young people who saw themselves in him. And though Carter would never be the same after this, he had done what he set out to do. He had made people see the truth. In the end, it wasn't the headline that mattered, it was the lesson.